Her child cried from hunger for 5 days, until a lone rancher said, "Prepare to go with me." 9 cents sweated in Clara Hensley's fist, while Silverton's wind peeled threads from her faded green dress and rattled the eaves like bones. Grace, 4 and Featherlight, sagged against her, breath thin as smoke after 5 days without food. Through Larson's window, warm hands passed bread. Her own reflection looked like a ghost begging to be let in. She whispered a bargain to God. She wasn't sure would answer. A hush slid over the muddy street. Conversation clipped mid-word. Harness bells muttered once and fell silent. A shadow shouldered across the glass. Boots stopped beside her, heavy enough to tremble the board. When Clara turned, a man filled the doorway to the world, tall as a barn beam, weathered, eyes the cold grey of a storm rolling off the peaks. Jacob Callahan, the rancher folks named in warnings and in grudging praise, the man who buried a wife and son after the fire. His gaze did not weigh Clara. It locked on Grace, and something in his face cracked. He spoke as if finishing a sentence he had started years ago. "Prepare to go with me." The boardwalk gasped. Mrs. Larson slid the latch. 2 men edged closer for the spectacle. Sheriff Daniels lifted a hand without knowing whether to calm or command. Clara clutched her coins. Why? Jacob's jaw worked once. He reached not for Clara but for Grace's wrist. Beneath grime lay a tiny braided thread, green and gold, tied like a promise. Jacob's breath hitched. Where did she get this? His voice wasn't thunder. It was a man stepping into a room he swore he'd never enter again. Clara swallowed. It was in my husband's jacket after the collapse. Jacob's grey eyes flashed with a recognition that didn't belong to stranger. He turned to the sheriff. If anyone stops us, they answer for a death. He looked back at Clara. Now choose. Behind them, a church bell struck noon. No one remembered hearing it ring. Clara Hensley learned how silence can weigh more than a shout in the 4 months since the mine caved, and took her husband, leaving only a bent helmet, a debt slip, and a coarse blanket. A foreman tossed over her shoulders, as if pity could heat marrow. Company housing lasted a pair of weeks. Then a man with a clipboard read names under a crooked lamp and pointed toward the road. She swaddled Grace in a thin shawl, sold the cradle, traded the wedding brooch for flour that stretched through 2 storms, burned a chair on a night so cold the window breathed frost inside, and counted coins down to 9. Each morning smelled of ash, soap and fear. Each evening she bargained in whispers with a heaven that seemed to have turned its face. Grace's breath grew faint across hard nights, until even whimpers vanished. The child who once chased dust motes and sang nonsense now curled quietly as bundled twigs, lips pale, eyelids heavy, heat flashing and fading without rhyme. Clara kept the girl pressed against her chest, counting heartbeats, spooning thin broth, boiled from bones until the water turned a tired grey. A cough rattled, failed, and left air thick enough to choke. She pressed her fingers to Grace's wrist and felt a flutter like a frightened moth. At dawn she wrapped the shawl tighter, tucked the 9 cents into her palm, and stepped onto Silverton's street, where mud clung to boots and judgment clung to faces. Wind skated along the ruts, lifted threads from her once green dress, and cut through cloth as if it knew her name. A team clattered past, wheels spraying grit. Someone pulled a child closer by the hand. 2 men speaking near the livery shortened their words when she approached, the way people do when misery might be contagious. She kept moving. The town smelled of coal smoke, damp rope, cold iron, yeast and tallow. She followed the smell of bread to Larson's general store, a rectangle of lamplight thrown across the boardwalk, bright as a light. Through the wavering pane, she saw a fence of loaves, pyramids of tins, jars ranked like soldiers, ribbon spools in cheerful colors that had nothing to do with hunger. She leaned her forehead to the glass until breath fogged the window, then pushed the door with her elbow, because both hands cupped every cent left between her and the poorhouse. The bell jangled. Mrs. Larson looked up with ledger eyes and the posture of a ruler. A pencil rested in the spine of the book, as if it were more backbone than paper. She assessed Clara's dress, the shawl, the child and the coins without moving her mouth. "Price is marked," she said at last. "Bread, milk, matches are in the back." Clara swallowed. "A small loaf and a bottle, please." She opened her palm. 9 dull discs winked like tired eyes. The storekeeper nudged the coins with the pencil tip, turned one, examined the tarnish, then set the tip down again as though the wood might catch poverty like a rash. "No charity here." She said it with starch. "Missions serve on Thursdays." She did not add where, and Thursday walked far from today. Behind Clara, boots scraped. 2 men drifted toward a barrel marked nails and pretended to study hardware while watching a cheap tragedy unfold for free. A church woman adjusted her gloves and murmured that a mother ought to stand at a washtub if she wanted to keep respect. Another voice suggested the husband should have chosen safer work, as if mountains post polite warnings and grief can be avoided by reading signs. The room collected opinions the way a stovepipe collects soot. Clara kept her voice steady. She named Grace's age, the collapse, the eviction, the brooch, the cradle, the chair burned on that night when the window breathed. "The child has not eaten in days," she said. "Please, a small bottle and a crust." Mrs. Larson's mouth held its line. "No charity here," she said again, a counter-edge wearing syllables. The clerk, thin and interested, turned a ledger page already blank. Sheriff Daniels stood near a rack of tinware, arms folded, badge dull in lamplight, eyes measuring the mood like a man watching a slow river for hidden currents. He had the look of someone who would like fairness and feared cost. The bell rang again. Wind and leather came through the doorway first, then a presence that steadied the room by simply existing inside it. He ducked beneath the lintel out of habit, though his height just cleared it, and paused while air rearranged itself. Jacob Callahan stepped across the boards, and talk stopped as if cut. He stood a head above most, and another hand beyond that, shoulders made for gates, weather carved into his skin, grey eyes like iron under cloud. His hands looked as though they could lift a post or break stone, yet the way they hung at his sides promised gentleness, if a fragile thing needed holding. People gave him space the way they give storms distance, when thunder stacks along the ridge. Sheriff Daniels shifted his weight, respectful and wary. The rancher had not been seen much since the fire, and when he was, rumors walked ahead like dogs. Jacob looked first at the child, not at coins, not at the counter, not at the faces tilted toward a spectacle. He stepped close without crowding, hat in hand. "Can she swallow?" he asked. No condescension, no doubt, only purpose. Clara nodded. He reached for a small tin of condensed milk, a loaf still warm, a wrapped wedge of butter, and a bottle from a low creek. He laid money on the counter without counting change. Mrs. Larson opened her mouth, closed it, and let the pencil rest. Jacob mixed the milk with water in a dented cup, warmed it a moment near the stove, cooled the rim against his wrist with a motion so practiced it told its own history, then offered it to Clara, as if the world might break if he hurried. Grace's lips parted. A drop landed on her tongue. She swallowed. Another. Color pricked her cheeks like sunrise scraping frost from a window. The clerk forgot his ledger. The boy by the door forgot his cap. A miner slid his knife back into his pocket as though cynicism should not be sharpened here. Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat. "All square?" he asked toward the counter in a voice pitched to the room more than the owner. Mrs. Larson did not like it, did not stop it, and could not fault the money. "He paid," she said, making the words sound like both admission and defense. Whispers tried to reform and failed. Jacob gathered parcels with a care that suggested breakability lived not in goods, but in people. He placed a loaf in Clara's hand, kept the bottle ready, and said, "Small sips." His tone was an instruction and a kindness at once. She obeyed because the command spoken gently landed like guidance, rather than control. Warmth ran down her arms from the tin. Something stung behind her eyes. She realized it was hope, risking a return. Mrs. Larson returned to the rule. "If this becomes a habit, we will have a line around the block," she said, civic virtue arranged like a display. Jacob did not answer. He looked to the sheriff. "We are done here." Not loud. Final. Daniels tilted his head as if hearing an old hymn. "Folks will talk," he warned, a statement shaped by experience, not threat. Jacob's mouth turned, almost humor, almost fatigue. "Let them talk about bread," he said. The sheriff nodded once. He did not move to block the door. Outside, cold pressed into cloth like a second skin. The sky wore iron. Mud showed yesterday's wheel ruts, frozen ridges that snagged skirts and patience. Breath smoked. The rancher set the parcels in a wagon, with the same care he had used at the counter. A sturdy team stamped and huffed, dark against a pale road. He did not assume consent. He faced Clara Square without crowding. "My place sits 10 miles west beyond a low pass and fir," he said. "Two-story house, sound roof, stove that draws, room enough for you and the girl. Food now, a doctor this afternoon if you wish. You come because you choose, not because I say." He did not recite rumors, did not sell himself, did not ask for thanks. He offered shelter and the time it takes a child to mend. Clara listened with suspicion, taught by months of closing doors. Help often comes with hooks, yet the memory of that cup at Grace's mouth argued harder than fear. "What do you want in return?" she asked, hearing steel in her own voice. He answered without flinching. He said he lost a wife and a boy to fire years back, a night when smoke stole air faster than hands could lift beams, and sometimes the only way a man refuses ruin is by turning outward when a child needs food. He said a house set for 3 had gone quiet, and sometimes mercy sounds like a room used again. He said he keeps to himself, because some wounds sit nearer skin than others, not because he enjoys hardness. Sheriff Daniels stepped onto the boardwalk, coat unbuttoned, hands visible. He did not forbid, only said he would ride out before sundown to ensure everything sat straight in the law's eyes and the town's, because order matters even when compassion walks. Mrs. Larson's door shut with a bell stroke that tried to sound righteous and sounded smaller than the moment. Clara looked at the wagon, the man who moved as if haste could cause breakage, the child whose eyes had lost that faraway glaze. Fear lived beside a rising heat that might be resolved if tended. Gossip would gnaw, the paper might claim authority, yet Grace had swallowed, and the bottle held more. Jacob shifted one bundle, then waited. He left space as if to prove this choice belonged to her alone. "I'll take you there," he said quietly. "If you say so." Her fingers tightened around the loaf. She lifted Grace higher, felt the small body settle, and nodded once, a movement as slight as a breath, and as binding as a vow. Jacob passed her the bottle, and climbed to the bench. Sheriff Daniels touched his brim. The team leaned into the harness. Wheels found groove. Silverton fell behind in a wash of grey boards and watching windows. Clara held her daughter and the bread and understood that fear can travel alongside hope without either yielding. And in that uneasy balance, she heard the promise inside Jacob Callahan's offer to take them to his ranch.
Clara stepped onto the wagon, plank slick with frozen mud, while Grace drew thin swallows from the bottle, each sip a small vote for life. Jacob waited until mother and child settled under the patched shawl, then set the team in motion. Hooves broke a crust of ice and found ruts hardened by cold. Iron rims rasped like a saw across old boards. Silverton's storefronts fell behind them, lanterns smearing in grit-blown air, faces shrinking to pale glints at windows. The wind crawled beneath cloth and set its claim on bone. Smoke hung low and mean, snagging on wire. A flyer tore loose from a nail chased them a few yards, then plastered itself to a fence as if the road itself refused to follow. Jacob turned them toward the pass. Sage hissed along the ditch. Snow lay in thin commas against rails and posts. He said the ranch sat 10 miles ahead. A good roof, a sound stove, water drawn clean even in winter. He said it like the weather, plain as a forecast a man would stake chores on. Clara listened, weighing that steady tone against the doors that had shut in her face, listening for the bill that help often hides behind gratitude. "What do you want for this?" she asked. "Nothing you don't choose to give," he said. "Food first, warmth, a doctor if you wish. After that you say." The sky wore a dull pewter sheen that swallowed color. Tailings glinted like old coins dropped and forgotten. The church roof dwindled to a black wedge. The smokestacks became 2 scars on the horizon.
Clara studied him in profile. Weathered face, jaw set like a gate latch, grey eyes that fixed rather than flitted, a coat with smoke worked into the wool, scars nicking the back of one hand in a neat ladder. He drove like a man who understood weight and how to shift it before something cracked. A wash cut the road and dropped them hard. Jacob braced the slide with a quick forearm at Clara's elbow, then withdrew before the touch could claim anything. He murmured to the roan. The horse found firm ground and pulled the wagon level. For a while only leather and iron spoke. Tug, creak, ring, breath, blown white as cotton. "I heard about the collapse," he said. "The mountain takes what it decides." He paused as if the next words had edges. "Fire took from me." The sentence lived somewhere deeper than talk. Clara remembered whispers, traded on doorsteps. A night barn lamp kicked, rafters catching like tinder, smoke crawling the ceiling, a man hauling beams until his arms gave and still arriving too late. "Your wife," she said softly, "and your boy." He nodded once, hat brim slicing the wind. "A house can go quiet so fast it steals time's boots," he said. "I went back through black air and came out with burns and a space that did not fill. Work wouldn't. Miles wouldn't. Prayer said plain or angry wouldn't. The rooms learned my footsteps, but they didn't answer." Grace swallowed again and rested her cheek on Clara's collarbone, with a tiny sigh that loosened the air. Clara kept the bottle tilted, counting the slow rhythm, forcing her own breath to match it. "I don't need sorrow," she said, not unkindly. "I need my girl fed tonight and tomorrow." "She will be," Jacob said. "So will you." He tipped his chin toward the tin. "Small sips until the doctor says different." Fire closed around the pass. Snow dust sifted off needled boughs and salted Jacob's hat brim. Resin thickened the air with a clean sharpness that cut through coal stink. A jay flared blue from a snag and vanished. "People will talk," Clara said. "They already did," he answered. "Their words leave tracks at my fence and stop there." The plainness of that boundary frayed something tight in her chest. She almost smiled and didn't. "Folks say you stay out of town." "True," he said. "For a while I didn't trust myself to stand where laughter had lived." He said it without self-pity, like a tally he kept for honest books. The road leveled and offered a kinder rhythm. Grace blinked with something near curiosity. Clara kissed her hair and tasted smoke and milk and a small sweetness she had been afraid to taste. "You still haven't named a string," she said. "There isn't one," he said. "There was a boy who loved a rope swing and a woman who laughed like a creek in Thor. I keep the house set because I fear forgetting their sound more than I fear loneliness." Silence followed, companionable and cautious. It rode between them like a beam carries a roof, useful, not heavy. Clara realized she wanted the town to see this moment, not to envy it, but to measure themselves by it. People judge fast. She had been judged at the company door, at the counter, on the street. She had judged Jacob too when his shadow fell across the glass. For anyone who might hear later how the pass opened, she wanted to ask a plain thing. When did you last judge in an instant, and miss the one chance to change a stranger's life by choosing kindness first? Wind shifted. Somewhere ahead, a gate clanged a lazy complaint against a post. Through a stand of young fir, the basin widened into a meadow rimmed by split-rail fence. Jacob angled the team toward a bluff, and the house came into view on a slight rise. 2 stories with a steep roof and a stout stone chimney, boards weathered to a calm silver, porch rail straight, steps swept even in winter. A barn stood a short walk away, doors tight, hay stacked square behind a half wall. In the corral a sorrel lifted her head, trotted once along the rails, then steadied, breath plume vanishing in the grey. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line as if the place breathed modestly while it waited. Closer, smaller truths surfaced and spoke without sound. A rope swing hung from a cottonwood limb, the seat worn smooth by small feet. A pair of tiny boots stood beside the back step as if a child might run out after a nap. A wooden horse, half-painted, perched on the porch rail, bright color curled by weather at the edges. Chalk ghosts traced letters near the threshold where small hands had practiced names. The sight hurt, but not like a wound pressed cruelly, It hurt like a hymn remembered at the door. Loss had arranged itself here with severe tidiness, and yet the place did not repel. It admitted sorrow and still invited living. Jacob slowed the team to a walk, guided them through the open gate, set the brake and sat a heartbeat longer as if asking the house permission. Fear and hope stood shoulder to shoulder inside Clara, like two people who had sworn never to speak and now needed to plan a life. He climbed down, came around with his arms ready, but not insistent. "May I carry her?" he asked. Clara considered, looked at Grace, eyes brighter, mouth milk-wet, and nodded. Jacob lifted the child with a care that suggested he feared breaking life. Clara stepped to the ground, boots finding packed earth sure, and glanced once more at the swing. The little boots, the wooden horse, the chalk. Each sign said love had lived here, and might yet live again. Jacob unlatched the door and stood aside, so Clara could carry Grace into warmth that felt earned rather than borrowed. A steady breath from a hearth burning clean. The house held stillness without vacancy. Braided rugs knitted the floor, a mantel faced with river stones lifted flame, and a long table waited beneath a window where frost painted ferns across the grass. 3 places had been laid long ago and left undisturbed. A blue plate with a chipped rim, a dented tin cup, an iron fork. A second setting with a fine crack running across the bowl. A third, where dust ringed a spoon, as if a small hand had just lifted it. On a chair hung a child's shawl folded with care that outlived its wearer. By the fire rested a slim book rippled by heat, its cover painted with a dove. Clara eased Grace onto a cushioned chair near the flames and felt springs answer softly, as if glad to be used after long quiet. The child exhaled a thin sound of relief and closed her eyes while color tiptoed back into cheeks that had stayed wan too long. Jacob set a kettle on a trivet, checked the damper, and moved with careful economy from stove to shelf to wash basin. His size suggested force. His hands contradicted the assumption. He poured warm water, scrubbed, dried on linen, then tied an apron around his waist like a man who trusted work more than speech. "The doctor can come after dusk if the road stays clear," he said. "Until then, food and rest." The thought of a real bed tugged at Clara like a promise she hardly dared to claim. She asked if there was a spare room. "First door on the right," he answered. "Sheets are clean, quilts heavy, basins fresh." He lifted Grace and climbed slowly, letting hope argue her bones into obedience. The guest room opened warm and neat. A bed made tight under a patchwork quilt, crisp sheets, smelling of sun, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, a small mirror that had learned to reflect grief without breaking. On the sill waited an unfinished wooden horse, its flank sanded smooth. Clara tucked Grace beneath the quilt and watched shoulders drop into honest sleep, a sight that undid weeks of hardness. Downstairs, Jacob had onions softening in fat, a carrot and a strip of salt pork hissing in a battered pot. He added beans from a jar, 2 potatoes diced with an eye trained by repetition, a pinch of thyme crushed between finger and thumb, then poured water and let the stew find its own voice. Bread warmed in the oven. He moved with unhurried purpose, signaling safety without word. Clara hovered, unsure whether to help, and he gave her a task that mattered without demanding strength. Tear the loaf into pieces, fetch 2 bowls, lay a cloth near the hearth, so steam could rise without dampening the wood. While the stew simmered, her rays returned to the table for 3, to the rippled book by the fire, to a tiny pair of boots lined on a shelf by the door. The ache those tokens carried was not thrust upon her. It simply existed, and strangely made the space feel honest. Jacob caught her glance and did not look away from what it meant. He spoke like a man reciting a private ledger. "I leave things where they sat because forgetting frightens me more than pain," he said. "But a house shouldn't punish the living." He ladled broth into a cup, cooled the rim against his wrist, and handed it to Clara. "Try." Heat traveled from tongue to chest and uncoiled along muscles starved for comfort. He filled a second cup for Grace and set it aside to carry up when she woke. Then he wiped his hands, drew a block of aspen from a basket by the hearth, and opened a pocket knife with a practiced flick. Shavings gathered like curled snow at his boot. A small bird appeared, beak first, then folded wings, then the suggestion of a breath. Clara watched knife and wood converse, then studied his face for the story he would not force into the room. Lines around the eyes deepened when a curl split wrong. His mouth tightened once, eased and carried on. Grief did not leave him. It guided his gentleness. She thought of Miss Larson's ledger stare, and the murmurs along Silverton Street, and a wish rose that strangers everywhere would choose a steadier measure of worth. When had she herself judged in a glance and missed a chance to change a life by choosing kindness first? Steam thickened the air with thyme and potato. Jacob set 2 bowls on a sideboard rather than disturb the family's places, added a wedge of bread on a folded cloth, and a pat of butter softened near the fire. They ate on low stools, leaving the shrine untouched. The stew filled the emptiness without demand. Clara felt warmth settle in places wind had owned for months. She said it was delicious as a fact. Jacob answered with a nod that respected hunger and dignity together. A soft sound drifted from the stairwell. Grace stood clutching the rail, hair sleep-tossed, eyes curious. Jacob rose at once, slow enough not to startle. He fetched the cup he had saved and knelt to offer it while keeping a distance so the child could decide. Grace sipped, swallowed, and whispered, "Good." The single word struck louder than a Clara's throat closed. Tears pricked. Relief shook through her like thaw running under ice. She laughed once, quiet and incredulous. Jacob smiled in a way that felt like a door cracked, just enough to let air move again. He returned to the hearth, took up the carving, and finished the bird. Then he sanded with a scrap of cloth until the surface felt like satin. "For you," he said, and set it in Grace's hands. She stroked the wings with solemn care, reading a language built from patience. Clara saw how Jacob gave feeling through deeds rather than speeches, turning his back while she adjusted a shawl to grant privacy, wiping a spill before it could cause a fall, checking the latch without announcing protection. When Grace tired, Clara carried her upstairs and tucked her in again. The small hand held the bird even as sleep took her, thumb circling the beak as if sealing a pact. A floorboard creaked in the hall, friendly, like a house learning new names. Back by the fire, Jacob washed bowls, dried them with linen, and stacked them with a modest click. He banked coals, added a small log, and sat with hands around a mug of hot water, a man who needed heat without taste. The swing outside turned once in a breeze that did not touch the porch. Somewhere near the barn, a horse stamped, then settled. The world narrowed to shelter, stone, timber, wool, light. "Thank you," Clara said at last. Words inadequate and still necessary. "You will not owe me," Jacob answered. "Help is a duty where I live." He did not add, "because fire took my family, or because I cannot bear another child starving, or because the table must not stay a shrine forever." The room already spoke those lines. Clara looked from the table for 3 to the rippled book to the boots by the door to the new carving upstairs. Past and present stood together without quarreling. The hearth sent a pulse through the floor that felt like a heartbeat relearning steadiness. Her fists unclosed. She realized she had been bracing for a price she could not pay. None came, only offers, sighs to dignity. Night pressed its face to the windows. Snow began, thin first, then steadier, ticking against the panes like distant sewing. Jacob checked the latch again, hung his hat, wiped the blade and set the aspen shavings aside for kindling. When he lifted the kettle and poured water over tea leaves, steam rose like a benediction. He handed her a cup. Warmth at her palms felt like proof. She sipped and studied the coals until shapes within suggested ridges, a valley, and a path leading forward. Grace slept above them, belly warmed, toy clutched. Silverton's cold voices lived far away. The ranch, haunted by love that had burned, felt like a place where living could begin without betraying memory. And because stories change people most when action arrives before applause, she wanted anyone listening to ask a plain thing of the self. When did you last help without measuring, return without waiting for witnesses, without setting a ledger beside compassion? If a stranger reached your threshold with a starving child, would you open the door first and sought judgment later? Jacob's presence carried gravity, not pressure, a guarded warmth that hinted at doors not yet open. Clara held her cup, heard the steady breath of the house, watched a faint sway of the swing's shadow across the window, and wondered whether she could trust this sanctuary. Hoofbeats broke the morning calm before Clara finished sweeping ash from the hearth, a hard drumming rolling down the lane like weather turning. She lifted Grace from the guest bed to the warm chair and watched a dozen riders crest the rise and spread along the split-rail fence. Sheriff Daniels led with hat brim low, badge dull under pewter sky. Beside him sat Mrs. Larson, rigid and prim. Behind them hovered churchwomen in dark shawls, lips pressed thin. Jacob stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, posture unhurried, eyes steady. He looked at horses, then papers in a gloved fist, and the cottonwood swing chain rattled once, as if the yard understood trouble. Daniels raised a palm. "Morning, Callahan," he said, voice careful. "We've had complaints." Mrs. Larson slid down, virtue stiff as starch. "Scandal," she said. "A widow, a man alone, a child inside. No minister. Impropriety cannot be allowed to fester." A churchwoman lifted a sealed envelope. "Order for custody transfer to the county home," she announced. "The girl will be safe under proper oversight." Clara held Grace and felt tiny fingers hook into her dress, and deeper still. "Please," she said. "She is recovering." Mrs. Larson sniffed. "No charity here," she recited, exporting her motto into a stranger's house. "Rules preserve mercy." Jacob stepped to the porch post. "This home is lawful," he said. "No harm. A child eats. A mother rests. That should end the talk." Daniels studied faces, paper, and the swing's shadow. "Town pressure is high," he said. "Petitions, letters." He nodded toward the envelope. "What statute?" "Vagrancy and moral endangerment," the woman read. "Removal when a guardian cannot provide respectable arrangements." Clara's stomach dropped the way it had when company housing closed. She lifted Grace higher, the child's head tucked under her chin. "Respectable," she said, fear sharpening the syllables. "The mine killed my husband, the company threw us into the cold. I have worked and begged, and you would rip her from the first bed that does not smell like smoke." Riders murmured, some in agreement, some uncomfortable. Mrs. Larson turned on Jacob. "You dazzle the weak with loaves and flame," she said. "But example matters. Widows will expect rescue. Standards will unravel." Jacob's voice carried like thunder without raising volume. "Standards that starve a child deserve unraveling." He came down the step. Stillness gathered. "You bring paper, I bring fact. A doctor comes at dusk. Food is working. No honest law moves a sick girl today." Daniels cleared his throat. "The county home keeps ledgers, beds, schedules," he offered weakly. "They keep ledgers," Jacob said, "not love." He spoke to the sheriff, not the chorus. "You know my land name, taxes, fences. I do not ask for noise permission. Look at her and decide as a man, not as a stamp." The sheriff's jaw worked. He looked at Grace, eyes clearer than yesterday, bird carving clutched, and at Clara's face thinned by months of hunger. "The statute requires proof of danger," he said. Mrs. Larson's answer snapped like ice. "Danger wears many garments. Temptation lives behind closed doors." She pushed the paper forward. "Sign receipt." Hooves poured frost. Leather creaked. The house seemed to hold its breath. Grace hid her face, then reached toward Jacob. He moved closer, hands open, voice soft enough to travel farther than a shout. "You will not take her," he said. "If a judge wants this, I'll stand before the bench. Until then you trespass against decency." A strand of snow lifted from the rail and spun away. Clara gripped the post to steady shaking knees. She had little strength for speeches, yet found one true. "Ask yourselves," she said, "if you have punished someone because it felt tidy. When did you last step beside a person the town scorned and say no?" Silence hit. The women studied Mittens, a ranch hand near the gate, stared at his horse's mane, then raised his eyes with quiet shame. Daniels rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I have discretion until a judge speaks," he said. "My discretion says leave them be." Mrs. Larson stiffened. "You will regret indulgence," she hissed. "The board meets on Monday. Petitions will multiply. The minister will preach order." "Let him preach compassion," Jacob said. "If his text cannot bear that weight, Choose another book. A rider laughed before caution strangled it. The sheriff turned his horse. You heard me, he told the group. Back to town. He tipped 2 fingers toward Clara, almost an apology, then faced duty again. The column peeled away, yet Mrs. Lawson lingered at the step and measured the doorway as if fitting a shroud. This is not finished, she said. When good citizens allow lax examples, decay follows. She pointed at Clara's faded green dress, as though cloth could condemn. Cover yourself next time. Children talk. Jacob's stare hardened. Ride, he said, and the single word thundered. She climbed up, complexion pale. Rain snapped. The churchwomen gathered like crows and drifted after the sheriff. Hoofbeats rolled across frozen ground until only the swing chain clicked, a thin metallic heartbeat. Clara sagged onto the step and pulled Grace into her lap. The child pressed the carved bird to her mouth and sighed, then caught Jacob's coat, trusting the weight of him. I thought they would take her, Clara whispered. They will try again. Jacob folded the rag and crouched, big hands resting quiet. They will bring sharper papers, he said. We will meet them with truth and witnesses who prefer mercy over gossip. The doctor will sign what he must. Daniels will balance risk against conscience. Snow thickened and softened edges. Smoke rose straight. Barn sounds ticked. A hen's soft cluck. A stall gate settling. Clara listened and understood how fragile safety becomes when cruelty masquerades as discipline. She kissed Grace's hair and let one tear track a warm line. I am afraid, she said. Good, Jacob replied. Fear keeps watch. Hope keeps strength. Together they hold a door. He stood and offered a hand. She rose. Eat, rest, then plan when the doctor... They went inside while the swing traced small arcs in the whitening yard, and retreating riders tossed warnings, schedules, threats of petitions, and promises of hearings that faded in the snow. Clara sank beside the hearth, tucked Grace beneath the quilt, and listened to Cole's talk in red syllables. Relief braided with dread, impossible to separate. The latch held, the pains held, the stew warned, but every comfort felt provision. In town, sermons would be sharpened, committees seated, minutes drafted, names copied in clean ink. When the next wave arrived, she would need to stand on legs that still shook. She touched Grace's cheek, promised fight, and looked to Jacob, a wall built from will, and understood this day had granted reprieve, not peace. Outside, the wind gathered the riders' words and sifted them across the pasture like grit. Clara felt time shorten, choices harden, and the law's distance shrink. She held Grace closer and counted breaths, each one a vow. Whatever came, papers, sermons, wagons, she would not yield her child. Yet night approached with a whisper that sounded like loss rehearsing out beyond the gate.
Snow glazed the pasture in a thin sheen, while the swing clicked once, a small metronome for a morning pretending calm. Clara fed the hearth, checked Grace's breath, and listened between gusts as Jacob hauled water from the pump. Hooves came before noon. Not a crowd this time, but a single beat, deliberate, like a gavel. A rider appeared on the ridge, coat flaring, hat low, shoulders squared for a practiced argument. Jacob stepped to the porch, eyes steady. The stranger reached the gate, dismounted with brisk precision, and tied his horse, as if the post owed him obedience. Henry Tate, he said, flipping back his coat to show a watch chain and a packet sealed with county wax. Clara felt a cold that wasn't the weather. Widow Hensley, Henry continued, voice trimmed for rooms where women wait by doors. I'm here to correct a shameful arrangement. I'm your husband's brother, and the legal next of kin to the child. Prepare her things. Grace shrank behind Jacob's leg, bird carving tight in her hand. She peeked around the coat and whispered, Papa, Jacob, as if a name could make shelter. Henry's eyes thinned. There it is, he said, proof of moral decline. He lifted the papers. Vagrancy, impropriety, guardian default, county oversight pending hearing, he read. The home will hold the girl until Monday. Then I'll claim permanent custody. Clara stepped forward. Grace is my daughter, she said.
You vanished when the mine fell. Where were you when the company keys turned? Henry's shrug looked rehearsed. Suffering grants no license to sin. He said, "This is indecent. My brother's name won't be dragged through mud by an idle widow and a rancher nursing private wounds." Jacob's silence carried weight. "I collect no one," he said at last. "I feed a child, shelter a mother, and ask no price." "Fine speeches," Henry answered, "but the town sees a woman under your roof without vows. These papers allow removal now. Argue later if you can afford counsel." Grace pressed her face to Jacob's coat. Clara fought the urge to run and planted her boots. "She is recovering," she said. "A doctor saw her last night and returns today. Take her now, and you risk her life." "Spare me theater," Henry snapped. "Hand her over." Jacob descended the step. His voice spread quietly and wide. "You will not cross this threshold," he said. "Bring the sheriff and a writ signed by a judge. Until then, turn around." "The clerk stamped this," Henry insisted. "A clerk files traffic," Jacob said. "A judge decides custody." Snow hissed along the rail. Curious townsfolk gathered by the fence, faces half hidden, eyes bright. Mrs. Larson stood among them, chin high. 2 miners hovered, uncertain. A child peered through slats, as if letters might rearrange into mercy. Henry spotted the audience and straightened. "Friends," he called, "I protect blood and restore order. This place cannot serve as a nursery." Clara moved closer to Jacob. "Order that feeds hunger with rules is a lie," she said. "My girl knew 5 empty nights. Here she eats and sleeps. You would send her to a ledger." "Ledger keeps the world honest," Henry said. "Sentiment makes women careless." Sheriff Daniels rode up, hat dusted white, expression tired. He took the packet, scanned the stamp and exhaled. "Clerk's mark," he said. "No judge." "Technicality," Henry argued. "The home holds her safely until Monday. Delay endangers reputation." The sheriff looked at Grace clinging to Jacob and heard the faint whisper, "Papa Jacob," as if the name could build a wall. His eyes changed. "I won't remove her on this," he said. Mrs. Larson protested. "The town will call you weak." "They call me many things," he answered. "I answer to the code and my sleep." Henry advanced a step. Jacob moved 1 foot, and the air cooled. He didn't threaten. He simply existed in a way that made threat unnecessary. Henry halted, swallowed, then tried Clara. "Sister," he said, borrowing a word, "do you think that man's strength will hold when scandal grows? You'll be left with ashes again." Clara tasted old smoke and answered with the marrow that had carried her through winter. "I won't hand my child to a man who found kinship only when the town handed him a pen," she said. "Bring a real order, and I'll stand where a judge can see me." Daniels nodded. "That's fair," he said. "Henry, ride back. File whatever you plan. I'll keep watch." Henry's mouth curled. "I go to the county seat now," he said. "On Monday I return with authority, a minister and a wagon. Have the child ready." Grace made a small sound that pierced the cold more surely than any shout. Jacob bent and spoke for her alone. "No one will carry you where you do not wish to go," he said. "Eat, rest, be brave." Henry mounted, jerked the reins, and wheeled hard, spraying slush in a petty show that fooled nobody. The onlookers drifted after him, murmuring predictions. Daniels lingered. "Expect a writ soon," he said low. "Have the doctor's notes ready, church allies if you can find them, and witnesses who saw improvement. The board dislikes losing face, but they dislike harming children more when eyes are on them." Jacob nodded. "We'll be ready." The sheriff touched his brim and left. The yard quieted. Snow softened hoof scars. Clara's legs shook now that stillness returned. Jacob guided her inside and set her near the fire. Grace climbed onto her lap and pressed the carving to her chest, as if the little bird could anchor her. "He'll come back," Clara said. "He'll bring words that bite. Then we answer with truth," Jacob said, "and with people who have learned to see." They began to plan. The doctor's testimony, a midwife who watched Grace swallow milk, a miner who had shared wages once. The clerk's boy who saw Mrs. Larson refuse bread. A pastor from a small mission who speaks louder with deeds than sermons. Clara considered the dress she would wear, the calm she would need, the firm way she would say, "My daughter." She breathed smoke, time and the clean scent of aspen shavings, and let fear and resolve sit together like two hands bracing a door against a storm. Outside, the swing turned twice, slow the way time moves when consequence approaches. Jacob fetched ledgers from a desk and spread blank pages, drawing columns for names, times and statements so nothing could be twisted. Clara listed dates since the collapse, items sold, nights outdoors and the moment Grace first drank warm milk in this house. Jacob noted receipts, tax records, and a letter from the doctor vowing to certify recovery and the danger of removal. Daniel's advice echoed, keeping them upright. Clara rehearsed plain sentences that would travel clean across a courtroom without apology. Grace dozed by the hearth, fingers resting on the wooden bird, breathing steady as an evening fell early, blue light settling over the yard while the swing traced a faint arc, and the pasture swallowed the last print. Across that quiet, Clara heard hooves and understood resolve would need to outlast paper when Monday finally arrived. Jacob set the ledger aside and lowered himself onto one knee beside the hearth, shoulders easing until his size matched the small world of the child. Grace leaned forward from the chair, bird carving cupped against her chest, studying his face with the grave attention hungry children give to a promise that might hold. "No one will take you while I breathe," he said. "I will stand in every doorway and speak before any bench. You are safe here." Grace touched his cheek with 3 careful fingers. "Papa, Jacob?" He covered her hand and nodded. Clara watched from the table where notes lay in ordered columns. The knot of fear that had tied in her shoulders loosened, while that vow moved through the room like heat. She sank to the rug, gathered Grace into her lap, and voiced the thing that stalked her nights. "If he returns with paper and men, I will fight though my hands shake. Yet a voice whispers that I could lose her again. I cannot survive that." Jacob set his palms on the floorboards, head bowed, as if kneeling in a chapel built from timber and firelight. "I know that voice," he said. "After smoke carried away my family, I judged every motion from that night and found myself wanting." A lamp kicked, rafters caught, and I ran into the heat, certain I would reach them. I did not. Guilt climbed into my bones and would not climb out. He lifted his gaze. "Work kept me upright, never whole. When I saw your girl through the glass, starved thin and holding on, the same terror struck. I could keep my door shut or open it and let something break, not in ruin, in mercy. I once believed safety required pews and vows," Clara said. "This house showed me shelter can begin with bread, a cup, and kindness without a ledger." Jacob took a small tin box from the mantel and opened it with the care of a man showing an old wound. Inside lay a plain gold ring, thinned by years of wear, engraved within with a name and a date that moonlight had tried to erase. "My mother wore this while she hauled water through winters harsher than this one," he said. "She slid it to me on the day I told her I had found a woman I could not imagine walking past. After the fire, I kept it shut away because the sight hurt. Then you stood at the store window with a sleeping child and 9 coins and more courage than I have seen in years." He closed his fingers around the ring. "I want to protect you, but that is not the sole reason I am on this floor. I want to share bread, chores, laughter, grief yet to come, and years that will roughen our hands and still leave us grateful. I ask for your hand because I love your strength, your refusal to bow before scorn, and the way Grace trusts light when it appears." Clara's breath hitched. She saw Grace with color back in her cheeks, and Jacob whittling hope from scrap. Love felt dangerous because it could be taken. Refusing it felt like turning away food after fasting. "Marriage is a wall against scandal," she said. "Is that the wall you want to raise?" "It will keep out some weather," he answered. "But I ask for a life, not simply a defense. If you say no, you still keep this roof until you choose otherwise. I will stand at the gate either way. If you say yes, I will spend my days proving that protection can be gentleness shaped into habits. He placed the ring in her palm. Warmth from the metal surprised her, as if the band had been waiting near the fire for a second use. She saw the faint engraving and thought of women who had worn it through lean seasons. What if I cannot carry a new vow without breaking? She asked. What if the town wins and steals grace despite the courts? What if grief returns in another form? Jacob set his hands around hers, not closing, only bracing. Then I will stand in the rubble a second time and a third, he said. I will not flee because pain repeats. I will count your breaths beside mine and keep counting. Grace slid from Clara's lap, set the bird beside the tin box, then returned and slipped a hand into each of theirs. We three, she whispered. Clara thought of the doors slammed since the collapse, the cold nights under a sky that did not answer, the coins traded for bread that lasted an hour. She also remembered Jacob testing milk on his wrist, carrying Grace as if light could bruise, and turning away during private moments so dignity stayed whole. Love did not demand, it offered. I am afraid, she said, but I will not teach my daughter that fear makes law. I want her to know that kindness can be chosen and kept. If I step toward you, I ask to be met as an equal. Equal suits me, Jacob said, something bright breaking across stern lines. Partnership tastes better than pride. He knelt again because Grace tugged his sleeve, and the moment belonged where small eyes could see hearts clearly. He slipped the ring onto Clara's finger. It settled as if returning from a long journey to a rightful home. Tears came. She let them. Clara pressed his hand to her cheek. Yes, she said. Yes, I will. Not to silence gossip, not to bargain with law, but to live, he exhaled. Relief plain. Grace clapped and leaned into them. They simply breathed together. Jacob spoke of fetching the minister who preached with deeds, not scorn, and asking Sheriff Daniels to witness so the paper would carry weight. Clara spoke of a dress mended with neat stitches, of writing to a cousin who might stand with them, of gathering friends whose voices could blunt Henry's claims. Planning felt lighter now that a shared future stood behind each line. When the town gathers, Jacob said, we will not meet them with bitterness. We will meet them with clear eyes, the doctor's statements, and the plain sight of a child no longer fading. And with this, Clara said, lifting their joined hands, ring glinting, let them see that vows can grow from compassion, not compulsion. Grace yawned. Jacob carried her upstairs, laid her beneath the quilt and left the door ajar so lamplight could keep shadows small. He returned and found Clara at the window watching snow feather across the yard. She turned, set her forehead to his chest, and listened to the rhythm there. Together, he said. Together, she answered. They banked the fire and checked the latch. Inside, the ring warmed. Clara remembered the woman who had counted coins with numb hands and whispered bargains into a wind that did not listen, and recognized the one who stood here now, not saved, not cured, but committed to a path that refused cruelty. She slipped her fingers through Jacob's, and felt his answering grip. Firm. We will be ready, she said. When Henry rides back, he will find a family.
Snow lifted before noon, leaving a pewter sky and a yard combed by wind. The swing chains still and chimney smoke straight as a promise. Clara smoothed the mended seams of her dress, touched the gold ring that warmed her knuckle, and lifted Grace so the child could watch the lane from the window's glow. Jacob checked the harness, squared the porch rail, nudged a fresh log onto the coals, then stood quiet, listening. Hoofbeats gathered past the cottonwood, not scattered gossip this time, but a column moving with purpose. Henry Tate led, coat snapping, jaw set. Mrs. Larson rode stiff and righteous. Behind them, townsfolk in layers of suspicion, curiosity, and cold. Sheriff Daniels came last, hat low, eyes troubled. They fanned along the fence as if measuring a claim. Henry dismounted, flicked snow from his sleeve, and held papers high. Widow Hensley produced the girl, he said. County authority backs me. This farce ends today. Miss Larson added frost. Decency requires action. Hand the child to lawful care. Jacob stepped onto the porch,
shoulders easy, gaze steady. "You brought noise," he said. "I'll answer with fact." He looked to Daniels. "Judge's writ or clerk's stamp." The sheriff took the bundle, thumbed the seal, and sighed. "Clerk again," he said, weary. Henry smiled without warmth. "Temporary custody through the home until hearing," he announced, projecting for the crowd. "We will prevent further scandal." Grace pressed into Jacob's leg, bird carving clenched, eyes lifted to his face. Clara came beside them, ring bright against winter light. "You delayed when hunger hollowed our nights," she told Henry, voice even. "You appear now because judgment pays." Grace stays. Mrs. Larson bristled. "A woman under a bachelor's roof invites ruin. A hungry child under any roof invites mercy." Jacob answered. "We answered." He turned so all could hear. "Before any of you open your mouths to condemn." He nodded toward Grace, cheeks no longer ashen, breathing steadier, small fingers no longer trembling the way they had in town. Murmurs softened at the edges. A miner tugged his cap, remembering a night when Jacob split wood behind a boarding house without taking coin. A seamstress tucked her hands into her sleeves and studied the little bird toy, the careful carving that spoke of time offered freely. Henry moved closer to the step. "Paper stands above sentiment," he said. "Remove the child." Jacob's answer rolled like distant thunder. "No." Daniels lifted a hand, mediating air itself. "We can settle this without splitting the town," he said. "The board meets on Monday. I won't seize a recovering girl on a clerk's say-so." Henry shot back. "You'll answer for weakness." "I'll answer for conscience," the sheriff replied. "Bring a proper writ." Mrs. Larson scanned faces, searching for a tide to ride. "If respectability bends, everything breaks," she warned. "Children must learn order." Clara set her palm on her daughter's head. "Order without compassion starves," she said. "This house feeds." Then Jacob let the next fact fall like a beam seated in stone. "There is more," he said, voice plain. He held Clara's hand where the ring caught pale light. "We are engaged. The minister comes this week. We will register with the county, witnessed by the sheriff, blessed or not by those who favor scorn. Whatever you thought improper loses its thin excuse." The yard shifted, as if the wind had changed. A blacksmith muttered, "Then there's no sin to swap." A school teacher whispered to a friend, "She looks stronger." A boy lifted himself on the lower rail to see the ring, and smiled before catching his mother's frown. Mrs. Larson hesitated, calculations rattling inside a mind used to clean ledger. "A performance," she said finally, yet the words sounded tired. Henry tried a new angle. "Engagements break," he sneered. "Promises evaporate under heat. My claim remains blood, which outranks kitchen theater." Daniels shook his head. "Claim means little without proof of ability and intent," he said. "What have you brought besides paper and noise?" The doctor's buggy creaked around the willow as if summoned by timing and necessity. He climbed down, breath steaming. "Child's improving," he reported, opening his satchel. "Pulse stronger. Removing her would be cruel." He signed a note, folded it, and handed it to the sheriff. The crowd's temperature rose a notch toward human. A churchwoman, who had come to scold, lowered her eyes and said, "I can send broth." The admission shaped like a prayer for forgiveness. A ranch hand near the gate raised a gloved hand. "Callahan helped fix my fence after the last blow," he volunteered. "Didn't ask a penny." A seamstress added, "The widow watched 2 little ones for me, so I could finish mourning ribbons. No charge." Stories, small as pine shavings, gathered into warmth. Henry heard the weather turning and laced his words with venom. "The county does not bow before porch sentiment," he snapped. "A judge will listen to me. He will listen to the sworn record," Daniels replied, holding the doctor's note. "He will see a ring and hear a minister confirm an engagement. He will hear from witnesses who carry no grudge." Jacob's tone stayed even. "This isn't applause," he said to the fence line. "It's responsibility. If you once judged us by rumor, consider whether you'll stand differently now. If any moment in your life asks for a second look, speak it. If kindness changed a stranger's path, share it so the town remembers what it can be." The subtle challenge moved like heat along iron. A miner cleared his throat. "I misjudged a man who went quiet after losing a child," he admitted. "Thought silence meant pride. Learned it meant pain. A shop girl lifted a hand. I told a widow to leave my step, she confessed, voice thin. I should have filled a cup. The crowd's center shifted again, away from icy certainty toward something that might outlast winter. Mrs. Larson felt it and tried to stiffen the air with one last warning. Standards still matter, she said. Children watch. Clara's answer carried no heat, only steady truth. Then let them watch mercy outmax spite, she said. Let them see men and women repair harm by telling the right story aloud. Jacob raised Clara's hand again. This vow began with bread, not gossip, he said. We will live it whether you clap or turn away. Grace, hearing firmness she could trust, released his leg long enough to learn how winter sun feels on a cheek when fear loosens. She lifted the bird toy toward the rail as if offering proof carved in patience. Henry saw influence slipping from his grip and tried one more thrust. You think a ring saves you, he said. You think sentiment overwhelms statute. Monday will teach you. Daniels answered first. Bring your best, he said. We'll bring ours. Jacob stepped down from the porch and stopped where snow met plank. A clear line. Leave my gate, he told Henry. Still not loud, still impossible to mishear. Come back with lawful paper if you dare, and prepare to stand inside a room where compassion has the louder witness. Henry recognized a wall he couldn't move without breaking himself. Anger twitched his rein. He climbed into the saddle, turned hard, then looked back, hunting for any face that enjoyed cruelty enough to cheer him on. None rose. The seamstress lifted her chin in quiet defiance. The blacksmith crossed his heavy arms and shook his head. The school teacher put an arm around the boy and whispered, "Remember this." Mrs. Larson's resolve wilted at the edges. "We will be watching," she said, yet the threat lacked steel. "Then watch well," Clara answered. "Measure honest." Henry pulled away, hooves cutting the yard into dark wedges that winter would soon smooth. The riders peeled off behind him, some ashamed, some relieved. The doctor's buggy followed slowly, satisfied that breath and color had improved. Daniels lingered. "I'll file the note, speak to the board and walk the minister to your door," he said. "Hold steady." Jacob nodded. "We will," he answered. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode. Quiet returned, tender and bright. Wind made a small sound in the cottonwood, more whisper than warning. Smoke kept its steady line. Clara stepped forward until her boots met the porch edge, lifted Grace to her hip, and felt the child's laugh land like a promise. Jacob stood beside them and laced his fingers through her. The yard held marks of hooves and of a town changing by inches, tracks that would fade, memory that would not. If you ever judged faster than you served, the day invited repair. If you once chose kindness and watched a story turn, tell it so another hand remembers how to open a door. Henry turned away at last. The three stood together, unbroken.
3 months later, the cottonwood cast soft shade across a yard that remembered winter only as a teacher, the swing drifting lazy arcs while meadow grass returned. Jacob walked beside a shaggy pony with an easy hand on the lead. Grace sat tall, boots tucked, the little bird carving tied to the horn with a blue ribbon Clara had rescued from an old hem. "Light hands," he said, patient as Thor, and the child breathed, settled and touched the mane with careful fingers. The pony snorted and plodded a tidy circle that stitched ovals into the soft ground. Clara watched from the porch with one palm over the small curve beneath her dress, feeling a pulse that promised another chapter. Her ring caught the morning like a quiet star. Bread cooled on the sill, soup rested under a cloth. The table, once set for 3 and haunted, now kept a 4th bowl ready not to replace memory but to live beside it. Warmth smelled of pine, soap and wool rather than fear. Grace laughed, a round sound no longer brittle, and Jacob grinned before letting go so confidence could grow. "You steer," he said. "I'm here." Those words crossed the yard and settled in Clara like heat. The ranch answered with small proofs of renewal, hinges oiled, rails tightened, hay stacked neatly, calves bawling, chicks peeping, a kitten washing paws on the sill. Smoke rose straight, steady instead of anxious. Tracks in the mud mapped chores instead of crises. Clara stepped down and crossed to the fence, memory pacing alongside present. She remembered Silverton's cold street, the pain that chilled her forehead,
the bell that rang for scandal, the first sip that saved a child, the porch where fear met resolve, the day a ring turned rumor into intention. Those pictures kept their edges, and yet are no longer cut. Jacob guided the pony under the cottonwood so Grace could brush a branch. Touch and release, he coached. The child did, giggling when leaves kissed her knuckles. Ordinary joy took root. Clara pressed her hand to the trunk and felt sap rising, the same upward insistence she sensed beneath her own palm. She looked toward the porch rail where a half-painted wooden horse still stood, witness rather than relic. Chalk ghosts near the threshold had faded to a blessing you could step across. Town remained itself, ledgers, sermons, bargains, but something had shifted after that day at the fence. A seamstress who once turned away a widow now left ribbon at the door. A miner who watched in silence offered to mend a gate. Even Mrs. Larson softened by inches, sending a jar of peaches for appetite, dignity intact, cruelty thinned. Sheriff Daniels stopped by for coffee, hat on the peg, leaving with a lighter face. The doctor came for stew and checked Grace with pleased economy. Habit still pushed quick judgments down the street, yet pause had entered the language. Grace finished her circle, and Jacob lifted her down with ceremony, setting small boots on earth like placing a flag. She ran to the swing, pushed once, and drifted. Clara moved beside her, palm resting on the new life turning inside. Hunger had trained carefulness, kindness had taught abundance, grief had taught respect, love had taught steadiness. Storms would return, fences would fail, bills would press, tempers would fray, yet the house had learned to breathe without flinching, and the people within knew how to hold fast without hardening. Grace hopped down, pressed the carving to Clara's belly, and whispered, "For babe." Jacob kissed Clara's temple, a daily affection rather than a performance. Afternoon slid toward gold. He watered the pony, she folded laundry on the rail. Grace scattered grain with extravagant seriousness. Yard sounds stitched a homely music. Bucket over stone, kettle song, rake teeth, through straw. A child's tune made from nonsense. Once hoofbeats meant trouble. Now rhythm meant a life faithfully kept. Clara thought of those who gathered months ago, measuring two futures from a fence line. Perhaps one handed bread to someone tonight. Perhaps another kept still when an unkind story tried to climb out. Perhaps a boy who watched a ring glint under winter light learned that strength can guard without crush. Such changes seldom earn a poster or a hymn, yet they tilt a place toward mercy. Evening moved in with lavender shadows along the rails. Jacob promised a ride tomorrow with only a lead from the bridle, and Grace repeated, light hands like a vow. They ate at a table that welcomed both the living and the remembered. Time dusted the stew, bread steamed, simple sweetness anchored the day. Talk circled small news, calves due, a neighbor's fence, a letter from a cousin, domestic notes that once would have sounded impossible and now rang true. After washing up, they stepped back outside to watch the ridge keep one bright seam, and then close it. A lamp warmed the window where chalk once traced hesitant letters. The ring felt alive against Clara's skin, part of work rather than sorrow. She looked at the yard and felt gratitude settle, not as fireworks, but as a reliable flame. Stories like theirs travel from cold into fire, and then toward warmth, yet they keep asking something of anyone listening. When did you last slow down a verdict and offer understanding first? What changed when you did? Did a stranger begin to look like kin? Will you carry that habit forward and tell it aloud so courage ripples past your own gate? If this tale steadied your breath, subscribe so the next one finds you, share it with a friend, and join a circle that celebrates compassion over spectacle. Will you stand for kindness like Jacob did? Share this story to inspire others. Grace climbed into Jacob's arms. The pony drowsed under the cottonwood. The air smelled of hay and bread. Clara leaned into both, palm over the child within, listening to two sure beats outside, and one tucked under her hand. Laughter rose and spilled over the rail. The house breathed with them. The valley held its gentle hush. They stood in a quiet that did not claim the world had mended, only proved that love chosen and practiced can hold. Clara smiled at Grace's laughter, and their family felt complete. She remembered Silverton's start to this journey, the mud that swallowed steps, the wind cutting cloth, the pain fogging beneath her breath, while bread sat beyond price, the clipped whispers, bell that summoned stare. She measured that against this porch, stone keeping heat, loaves cooling within reach, a laugh steering evening, a man's strength holding watch without tribute. The road between town and ranch spanned miles and years of habit. Crossing it asked courage, repeating it requires practice. Keeping it open demands storytellers. She hoped others would try the same passage. Pause, withhold a verdict. Offer bread first. Let mercy speak before rulebooks. If even a handful followed, streets would sound different, doors would open faster, and children would grow braver. That wish did not scold. It invited. She breathed, listened to the steady house and chose to keep telling what happened, until kindness felt ordinary.